The last time anyone saw the Kinsley brothers was on a July afternoon in 1997, walking back toward the forest in their Boy Scout uniforms. When a severe storm hit, it was assumed the boys were tragically lost to nature's fury, a belief that comforted no one yet brought the official search to a close. But 11 years later, the clang of a logger's machine hitting a buried shipping container would finally break the case open, revealing a sinister truth hidden just beneath the forest floor. The sky over the state forest was turning a bruised, sickly color long before the sun was due to set on July 12, 1997. Inside the Kinsley residence, situated near the forest's edge, the shifting light initially went unnoticed. It was the silence in the house, the absence of two specific voices, that first registered as wrong. Myra Kinsley checked the clock again. Her sons, 13-year-old Ronan and 11-year-old Jerick, were late. The boys had spent the afternoon at a scheduled Boy Scout troop meeting, a routine gathering held at a clearing just inside the forest perimeter. The meeting had concluded hours ago. By now, Ronan and Jerick should have been home, shedding their uniforms and demanding snacks. Ronan the elder was typically responsible, recognizable in his tan, short-sleeved shirt and dark shorts, his blonde hair neatly parted. Jerick, quieter and more observant, wore the olive-green, long-sleeved version of the uniform, a unique circular pendant hanging from the red cord around his neck. They were inseparable, bound by more than just brotherhood. They shared an intense curiosity about the sprawling wilderness that began practically at their doorstep. Myra mentioned their tardiness to her husband, Finian. Initially, the concern was mild. Perhaps the meeting ran long, or they had stopped at a friend's house. But as another 30 minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the house began to change, mirroring the rapidly deteriorating weather outside. The wind was picking up significantly, rattling the windows with a low, insistent moan. The forecast had mentioned a chance of rain, but this felt different. It felt heavier, more aggressive. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop, creating a palpable tension in the air. Finian stepped outside. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the air carried the thick, metallic smell of an imminent downpour. The trees bordering their property were thrashing violently. This wasn't a summer shower. It was a severe, fast-moving storm front. The realization shifted the parents' worry into a sharp, cold panic. If the boys were still out there, they were exposed. They began making calls. First to the scoutmaster. He confirmed the meeting had ended on time around 3:30 p.m. He mentioned having taken a group photo earlier that day, capturing the boys standing formally on a dirt path holding their wide-brimmed hats, a moment of calm before the storm broke. He hadn't seen Ronan or Jerick since the troop dispersed. Calls to other parents yielded the same result. The Kinsley brothers had seemingly vanished after the meeting concluded. With the storm now breaking, rain beginning to lash down in horizontal sheets, Myra and Finian made the agonizing decision to contact the local sheriff's department. They officially reported Ronan and Jerick Kinsley missing. The words felt surreal, disconnected from the reality of their lives. Authorities arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the deluge, but their ability to act was immediately hampered by the ferocity of the weather. Visibility was near zero, and the noise of the wind and rain made communication difficult. They needed information, a starting point. They began interviewing the other boys from the troop, hoping someone knew where the brothers might have gone. The crucial piece of information came from Wesley Prather, a close friend of the brothers. Wesley told investigators that Ronan and Jerick had no intention of going straight home. They had a plan. According to Wesley, the brothers had recently discovered a hidden cave deep within a less-traveled section of the Oak Haven forest. They were excited about it, treating it as their secret headquarters. They had planned to re-enter the woods immediately after the meeting, to spend more time exploring it. Wesley hadn't gone with them. He had noticed the sky darkening and the wind rising, and decided to head home instead. He recalled urging the Kinsley brothers to do the same, but Ronan, emboldened by his recent scouting achievements and the thrill of adventure, had insisted they would be fine. He watched them walk away, disappearing back into the trees while everyone else headed for the parking lot. This revelation provided a destination, but it was a terrifying one. The cave, as described by Wesley, was remote, situated miles from the meeting point. If the boys had attempted the hike, they would have been deep in the wilderness when the storm hit its peak. The implications were grim. The authorities hypothesized that the brothers were likely seeking shelter, perhaps in the cave itself, or worse, had suffered an accident in the treacherous conditions. But knowing where they were and reaching them were two different things. The storm was raging with an intensity rarely seen in the region during the summer. The trails were turning to mudslides, and the risk of falling trees made entering the forest a life-threatening endeavor, even for trained personnel. There would be no full-scale search until the weather broke. For Myra and Finney and Kinsley, the night of July 12th was defined by the howling wind and the unbearable weight of waiting. The assumption was that the boys were lost, cold, and fighting for their lives against the elements. The storm raged throughout the night, an unrelenting assault of wind and water that seemed to shake the foundations of the Kinsley home. Sleep was impossible. Myra and Finney could only watch the clock and imagine the conditions their sons might be enduring. The Oak Haven State Forest was vast, encompassing thousands of acres of dense woodland, steep ravines, and winding creeks. It was easy to get lost in broad daylight. In the midst of a tempest, it was a death trap. The thought of their sons alone in the darkness, exposed to the fury of the storm, was a constant, agonizing torment. At the first hint of gray light on the morning of July 13th, the search operation mobilized. The scale was massive, involving local law enforcement, state police, park rangers, and hundreds of volunteers from the community. The trailhead parking lot where the Boy Scout meeting had taken place was transformed into a bustling command center. The air was still heavy and wet, but the wind had subsided, allowing the searchers to finally enter the woods. The environment they encountered was unrecognizable. The storm had fundamentally altered the landscape. Trails that had been clear paths the day before were now choked with debris. Ancient trees had been ripped from the earth, their massive root systems exposed like skeletal hands. Creeks that were normally ankle-deep had swollen into raging torrents, carving new paths through the forest floor. The ground itself was a thick, sucking mud that made every step an exertion. The primary focus of the search was the area between the scout meeting point and the location of the cave. Wesley Prather, despite his youth and the trauma of the situation, accompanied a team of experienced trackers to guide them toward the secret spot. The journey was arduous. The terrain leading to the cave was naturally rugged, characterized by rocky outcrops and dense underbrush, and the storm damage made it exponentially more difficult to navigate. The searchers worked in organized grid patterns, calling the boys names, the sound swallowed by the dense, wet foliage. They used ropes to cross flooded areas and chainsaws to clear paths. The physical toll was immense. The volunteers, driven by a desperate hope of finding the boys alive, pushed themselves to the brink of exhaustion. The first day of the search yielded nothing. As darkness fell, the teams were forced to retreat, disheartened and frustrated. The temperature dropped, adding the risk of hypothermia to the list of dangers the boys faced if they were still out there. The second day, July 14th, the search resumed with renewed intensity. Specialized teams equipped with climbing gear and mapping technology pushed deeper into the remote areas Wesley had indicated. The terrain here was rugged, characterized by steep inclines and rocky outcrops, making the journey even more difficult. It was late in the afternoon on the second day when a breakthrough finally occurred. A search team located a cave matching the description provided by Wesley. It was situated in a remote ravine, its entrance partially obscured by a landslide of mud and rock triggered by the heavy rains. The sight of it immediately dampened the spirits of the search party. It was difficult to access, and the surrounding area showed clear signs of violent water movement. Investigators cautiously entered the cave. It was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The first priority was to determine if the boys had actually made it this far. The cave floor was covered in a thick layer of fresh silt, making the search for footprints or dropped items nearly impossible. The search seemed to be hitting a dead end until one of the trackers noticed something near the entrance. It wasn't a belonging or a piece of clothing. It was a knot. Tied securely to an exposed root system near the cave opening was a length of red cord identical to the type used in the Boy Scout uniforms. The cord had been fashioned into a complex, intricate knot. It was immediately recognized as a specialized scouting knot, one not typically known by junior members. Wesley Prather was brought to the site to examine it. His reaction was immediate. He confirmed that this specific knot, a variation of a friction hitch, was something Ronan Kinsley had only recently mastered. Ronan had been intensely proud of this achievement, practicing it incessantly and showing it off to the other scouts. According to Wesley, Ronan was likely the only boy in their troop capable of tying it correctly under pressure. The discovery of the knot was pivotal. It strongly suggested that the Kinsley brothers had reached their destination shortly before the storm hit its peak. It seemed like a marker, perhaps left by Ronan to signify their arrival, or even as a practice exercise while waiting for the rain to start. But why they left the cave, or what happened next, remained a mystery. The physical evidence inside the cave pointed toward a grim scenario. Along with the silt on the floor, investigators noted debris, leaves, twigs, and mud lodged high on the cave walls several feet above the heads of the searchers. This was a high water mark, clear evidence that the cave had experienced significant, sudden flooding during the storm. The ravine outside had acted as a funnel, channeling the torrential runoff directly into the opening. The prevailing theory began to solidify, and it was devastating. Authorities believed the boys had been caught in a flash flood within the confines of the cave. The force of the water would have been overwhelming, giving them little chance of escape. The alternative theory was only slightly less horrific. Perhaps they saw the water rising and attempted to flee, only to become hopelessly lost and disoriented in the surrounding wilderness during the height of the storm. The discovery of the knot focused the search efforts, but it did not make the task any easier. The search radius was expanded significantly around the cave area. Divers were brought in to search the swollen creeks and temporary ponds created by the floodwaters. K-9 units specialized in tracking and cadaver detection crisscrossed the terrain. The community mobilized with an intensity born of shared grief and the desperate hope of finding the boys alive. Weeks dragged on. The summer heat returned, baking the mud dry and making the air thick and humid. The media attention gradually faded, and the number of volunteers dwindled. The physical toll on the search teams was immense, but the emotional toll was even greater. Despite the most exhaustive search operation in the region's history, no further trace of Ronan or Jerick Kinsley was found. No clothing, no equipment, nothing. It was as if the storm had simply washed them away. The absence of any evidence outside the cave reinforced the belief that they had perished in the flood, their bodies perhaps buried under tons of silt or carried miles downstream into inaccessible marshland. The investigation stalled. There were no suspects, no signs of foul play. The knot at the cave entrance was interpreted as the last artifact of a tragic accident. For Myra and Finian Kinsley, the uncertainty was a torment. They held memorials without bodies, clinging to the faint hope that their sons might one day be found. The case of the Kinsley brothers was officially declared cold. It was categorized as a tragic accident, a case of two adventurous boys caught in an unforgiving act of nature. The Oak Haven State Forest kept its secrets, and the story of the vanished Boy Scouts became a local legend, a cautionary tale told around campfires. Life in the community moved on, but the scar remained, a wound that refused to heal. 11 years passed. The narrative shifts to October 2008. The Oak Haven State Forest remained largely unchanged, a vast expanse of wilderness that resisted human encroachment. The story of the Kinsley brothers had faded into local lore, a tragic footnote in the history of the region. However, economic pressures had led the state to open up new, previously inaccessible sections of the forest for logging operations. One such area, located deep within the forest, miles beyond the perimeter of the 1997 search area, was being actively harvested. The noise was deafening. Heavy machinery chewed through the dense woodland. The roar of chainsaws and the grinding gears of skidders echoed through the trees. A logging crew was working against a tight deadline, clearing attractive land that had been virtually untouched for decades. The work was grueling, the terrain rugged, and the isolation complete. They were deep in the woods, far from any paved road, in an area where cell phone signals were non-existent. Jerick Vane was operating a feller buncher, a massive machine designed to cut and gather multiple trees simultaneously. He was an experienced logger, accustomed to the rhythms of the forest and the resistance of the earth. But on this particular afternoon, as he cleared a dense patch of underbrush near a natural depression in the terrain, his machine struck something that didn't yield. That it wasn't the dull thud of a buried rock or the yielding resistance of a root system. It was the sharp, metallic clang of steel on steel. Jerick, the logger, immediately shut down his machine and climbed out of the cab to investigate. He found a thick layer of topsoil, pine needles, and decaying leaves concealing the object, which looked like it had been intentionally buried and camouflaged. He kicked at the dirt, exposing a small section of rusted metal. It appeared to be a flat sheet of corrugated iron. Curiosity piqued. Jerick called over a couple of his co-workers, who grumbled about the interruption but gathered around the discovery. Together, they used shovels to clear away the debris, revealing that the object was no simple sheet of metal. It was a large, square metal hatch, heavily rusted and set into an even larger structure buried deep in the earth. The discovery was unnerving. This area was remote, miles from any sign of human life. The possibility of a septic tank or forgotten root cellar was quickly dismissed. The location made no sense. Jerick tried to lift the hatch, but it was incredibly heavy and the hinges were fused with rust. Using a crowbar, the crew managed to pry it open. The hatch groaned, revealing a dark, cavernous opening leading straight down into the earth. A stale, musty odor wafted up, the scent of decay, mold, and damp earth. As they peered into the darkness, the structure's shape became clearer. It wasn't a tank or a cellar, it was a shipping container, deliberately buried underground. A heated debate erupted among the crew. Jerick's colleagues wanted to cover it back up and forget about it. They were already behind schedule, and bringing in the authorities would mean shutting down their operation, jeopardizing their pay. "It's probably just an old survivalist bunker or a hunter's cache," the foreman insisted. "It's not our business. Let's just cover it back up and move on." But Jerick couldn't shake a profound sense of unease. As a father himself, the sight of the buried container, the darkness within, and its intentional concealment filled him with dread. Something felt deeply wrong. The sheer effort required to bury something so large in such a remote location suggested a sinister purpose. He made a decision. He was going to report it. The remote location meant no cell service. Jerick had to drive his truck several miles down treacherous logging roads until he reached a main road with a signal. The drive felt agonizingly long, the silence amplifying his growing fear. He finally reached a spot where his phone showed a signal and called the county sheriff's office, describing what they had found. Recognizing the unusual nature of the discovery, the sheriff's department dispatched deputies to the scene. Hours later, the deputies arrived, guided by Jerick. The logging operation was halted, and the area was secured, transforming from a work site into a potential crime scene. The deputies began excavating the area around the container, a massive undertaking that required the use of the logging equipment. As the dirt was removed, the full scale of the container was revealed, a massive 40-foot shipping container buried in a deep trench. Its visible surface was covered in thick, flaky layers of orange and brown rust, with patches of green moss cementing its age. The container sat in the muddy trench like a rusting sarcophagus unearthed from the forest floor. The initial inspection suggested the container had been buried for a very long time. The focus then turned to the interior. Investigators, equipped with powerful flashlights and protective gear, cautiously climbed down into the darkness. The descent felt like entering a grave. The air inside was thick and foul, difficult to breathe. The flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a horrific tableau, a makeshift living space that hadn't been occupied in years. 2 decaying mattresses lay on the floor, covered in mold and rodent droppings. The floor was littered with debris, empty food wrappers, crushed cans, and plastic bottles. The packaging and brand logos suggested they dated back to the late 1990s or early 2000s. The sheer volume of debris indicated someone had lived there for an extended period, but it was the nature of the items found that shifted the atmosphere from unsettling to horrifying. Scattered among the debris were items incongruous with an adult survivalist or hunter. Comic books from 1997, a corroded portable CD player, and CDs with bands popular among teenagers of that era. The items suggested young occupants, a chilling realization for the investigative team. They meticulously searched the container, cataloging and photographing every item. The conditions were appalling, and the environment was hazardous due to the mold and rust. The investigators worked under the assumption that this was a crime scene, but they had no context, no missing persons reports that matched the scenario. Then, amidst the decaying fabric of one of the mattresses, an investigator noticed a glint of metal. He carefully retrieved the object, a small, circular metal pendant on a faded, frayed red cord. The tarnished pendant's unique design was still visible. Though it seemed a minor piece of evidence, standard procedure required it to be cross-referenced with cold case files. The pendant was processed, and its description was entered into the state's missing persons database. The search returned a match. The pendant was a perfect match for an item described in a missing persons report filed 11 years earlier. The report detailed the disappearance of 2 brothers, Ronan and Jerick Kinsley, in the Oak Haven State Forest in July 1997. The report specifically mentioned that Jerick Kinsley was wearing a unique circular pendant on a red cord when he vanished. A photograph from the file, taken on the day they disappeared, showed Jerick wearing the exact same pendant. The realization hit the investigative team like a physical blow. The buried container, the comic books, the mattresses, it all suddenly made a horrific kind of sense. They hadn't found a hunter's cache. They had found the place where the Kinsley brothers had been held. The discovery immediately transformed the investigation. This was no longer a local matter. The implications of a long-term abduction required specialized resources and expertise. The county sheriff immediately contacted the FBI. The cold case of the vanished Boy Scouts had just burst wide open, revealing a darkness far greater than anyone had imagined. The discovery of the buried container deep within the Oak Haven State Forest triggered an immediate and massive response. Within 24 hours, the remote logging site was transformed into a major crime scene. FBI agents arrived, their dark blue jackets with bold yellow letters standing in stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of the forest. They secured the scene, establishing a strict perimeter and taking control of the investigation from the local authorities. The silence of the forest was replaced by the hum of generators and the crackle of radios. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, was consulted immediately. The nature of the discovery, a hidden underground bunker designed for long-term captivity, pointed to a specific type of offender, one characterized by meticulous planning, patience, and a terrifying degree of organization. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully orchestrated operation. The first priority was a detailed analysis of the site itself. The container was photographed extensively, both inside and out. It was immediately clear that this was not a hastily constructed shelter or a temporary hiding place. It was a prison designed and built with chilling premeditation. The container had been modified significantly before being buried. Investigators discovered a sophisticated, custom-built ventilation system, a striking feature that revealed the perpetrator's meticulous planning and technical expertise. It consisted of a complex network of buried ducts, specialized fans, and filters designed to circulate air while remaining concealed. The intake and exhaust vents were located hundreds of feet away from the container, hidden within dense thickets of brush. The hatch, the only entry and exit point, had been reinforced with heavy steel bars and secured with multiple custom locking mechanisms, specifically designed to prevent escape from the inside. The realization confirmed the horrific reality. Ronan and Jerick Kinsley had not stumbled upon this place. They had been held captive here, buried alive in the darkness. The logistics of the operation were staggering. Burying a 40-foot shipping container in such a remote location required significant premeditation and the use of heavy equipment like excavators, bulldozers, or even a crane. It implied that the perpetrator had access to the area and the means to operate heavy machinery without arousing suspicion. While the behavioral analysts worked on profiling the offender, forensic teams began the painstaking process of searching the container for evidence, DNA, fingerprints, hair, or any trace evidence that could identify the perpetrator or confirm the presence of the victims. The work was slow and grueling, conducted under the glare of portable lights, the air thick with the stench of decay and the threat of biohazards. However, the environment inside the container proved to be a forensic nightmare. The years of moisture, fluctuating temperatures, and pervasive rust and mold had degraded any potential biological evidence. The surfaces were covered in a thick layer of grime, making fingerprint recovery impossible. The mattresses and clothing remnants were so decayed that any DNA present had long since broken down. Despite the most advanced forensic techniques available, the site was forensically barren. The perpetrator had not only hidden the crime scene, time and nature had effectively sterilized it. The discovery of the container shattered the long-held theory that the Kinsley brothers had died in an accident during a storm. The narrative of a tragic flood was replaced by a far more sinister reality. It was now undeniably an abduction case. The storm, which had been seen as the cause of their disappearance, was now viewed as a tragic coincidence. The chaos and confusion caused by the weather had likely aided the abductor, providing cover for the crime and erasing any potential tracks. The investigation shifted focus. If the boys were abducted, how did the perpetrator manage to transport them deep into the forest and bury them in a pre-prepared prison without being detected? The key lay in the logistics of the operation. The use of heavy machinery was the most promising lead. Investigators began researching the history of the specific tract of land where the container was found. Land records revealed that while the area was state-owned, it had been leased in the mid-1990s to a small, independent construction aggregate company. The company specialized in quarrying stone and gravel, operations that inherently involved the use of heavy equipment. This lease provided a plausible explanation for how someone might have had the access and the justification to operate excavators and bulldozers in the area without drawing immediate suspicion. The noise and disruption from the quarrying operation would have masked the activity of burying the container. Authorities theorized that the perpetrator was likely connected to this company. The investigation now faced the daunting task of identifying and tracking down the individuals associated with the defunct operation, hoping to find a connection to the buried prison and the two boys who had been held captive within its rusted walls. The discovery of the aggregate company's lease on the land provided the investigation with its first concrete lead. The timeline matched. The company was active in the area in the mid-1990s, around the time the container must have been prepared and the boys disappeared. The logistics also aligned. The company had the heavy equipment necessary to bury a shipping container. The investigation pivoted sharply, focusing on identifying and tracking down anyone associated with the defunct operation. The company had gone out of business in the early 2000s, and its records were incomplete and disorganized. The task of compiling a list of former employees, contractors, and management was arduous, requiring investigators to track down scattered paperwork, tax records, and permits stored in dusty warehouses. The process took weeks, with a team of analysts meticulously reconstructing the company's operations from fragmented data. As they dug deeper, a murky picture began to emerge. Interviews with former employees and local residents revealed that the company had a reputation for cutting corners and operating on the fringes of legality. They were known for disregarding environmental regulations, and there were persistent rumors that they used the state land for illegal dumping, burying hazardous materials to avoid disposal fees. The remote location and lack of oversight provided the perfect cover for these illicit operations. This revelation led to the development of a compelling new theory. Perhaps the abduction was not the primary motive. Investigators hypothesized that the Kinsley brothers, exploring near a cave, might have stumbled upon the illegal dumping operation in progress. The workers, fearing exposure, might have panicked and silenced the boys, using the shipping container, perhaps already on site for storing equipment or materials, as a temporary holding cell or even a makeshift tomb. This theory gained significant traction. It seemed a straightforward explanation for the involvement of heavy machinery and the presence of the container. It also aligned with the company's known shady practices, shifting the motive from predation to crime cover-up. It seemed more plausible than the idea of a solitary predator orchestrating such an elaborate abduction scenario in the midst of an active mining operation. The investigation focused intensely on the company's foreman from 1997. He was identified as a man with a significant criminal record, including multiple charges of assault and battery. He was known for his volatile temper and his willingness to use intimidation. Former employees described him as ruthless and unpredictable, a man capable of violence and motivated to protect the company's illegal activities. He seemed like the prime suspect. Locating the former foreman took several weeks. He had moved to another state, living a transient lifestyle and working odd jobs in construction. FBI agents tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. The confrontation was tense. The agents, prepared for a hostile reaction, were aggressive, confronting him with the evidence of the buried container and the disappearance of the Kinsley brothers. They pressured him about the company's activities in the Oak Haven forest, suggesting the boys had seen something they weren't supposed to see. They painted a picture of a man desperate to protect his livelihood, willing to do anything to cover up his crimes. The former foreman was defiant and uncooperative at first, denying any knowledge of the container or the missing boys. He dismissed the allegations of illegal dumping as rumors spread by disgruntled former employees. But as the interrogation wore on and the agents hinted at potential federal charges for environmental crimes, his demeanor changed. The container's lack of forensic evidence made identifying the culprit seem impossible. Investigators decided to go back to the physical evidence, focusing on the container's unique, sophisticated modifications. The key, they believed, was in its construction. The custom-built ventilation system was the most distinctive feature. Unlike a standard solution, it used specific high-grade industrial components, specialized inline fans, HEPA filters, and heavy-duty ductwork. These weren't typically available to the public and were designed for high-reliability industrial applications like commercial buildings or hospitals. This indicated the perpetrator had specialized knowledge and access to specialized equipment. Investigators decided to trace the ventilation parts, hoping to identify the purchaser. The manufacturer of the fans and filters cooperated fully, providing a list of regional distributors from the mid-1990s. Tracing over a decade-old sales records was a daunting task. Many distributors were gone or had purged records. However, one large industrial supply company still had them, stored on microfilm. For weeks, a team of analysts painstakingly reviewed thousands of transactions. They focused on cash sales or small orders that might be harder to trace. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, anyone who purchased these components around the time of the boy's disappearance. The search yielded hundreds of transactions. They cross-referenced the sales with people who had access to the Oakhaven Forest area, but weren't direct company employees. They were looking for someone on the periphery. They found a match. A cash transaction for 2 specialized inline fans and several HEPA filters from March 1997, 4 months before the abduction. The purchaser's name was Orson Bllythe. A background check was immediate and alarming. Bllythe was a reclusive HVAC specialist with his own small business. He had the specialized knowledge and skills to build the ventilation system. He also had legitimate access to the Oakhaven Forest, working as a subcontractor for the aggregate company's equipment and for the state on remote utility stations. His utility truck provided a perfect way to move in and out of the wilderness unnoticed. A deeper background check solidified him as the prime suspect. Investigators discovered he had been a volunteer with a different Boy Scout troop in the early 1990s. He had been quietly asked to leave due to unspecified boundary issues. Interviews with troop leaders revealed he'd been overly focused on certain boys, offering gifts and private lessons. There were accusations of favoritism and inappropriate physical contact. The profile matched the behavioral analysis unit's predictions: a solitary, meticulous planner with specialized skills, access to the area, and a history of predatory behavior toward young boys. The evidence was circumstantial, but the combination of the specific ventilation components, Blythe's background, and his access made him the most compelling suspect. The shadow figure finally had a name. The investigation focused on locating and confronting Orson Bllythe. Authorities found him in his late 50s, living a solitary life in a small, isolated house with an attached workshop. The FBI placed him under surveillance, noting his predictable, unremarkable routines. He still worked in the HVAC industry and possessed the technical skills and access to the specialized equipment used in the container's construction. Based on the evidence, the FBI secured a search warrant for Blythe's property. The raid was swift. A tactical team found Bllythe inside, startled but not resistant. He was handcuffed and placed in a patrol car. The search began immediately. While the house was meticulous, reflecting his nature, it lacked the typical trophies of a predator. However, in his workshop, they found something far more damning. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet were detailed architectural drawings and schematics for a buried shipping container, complete with the complex ventilation system. The blueprints were a perfect match. The schematics were the smoking gun. Further search revealed receipts for renting heavy equipment, an excavator and bulldozer, from March 1997, the same month he bought the ventilation parts. The rental company was in a neighboring county, showing a deliberate attempt to avoid local detection. In a dusty box in the attic, they found the most disturbing evidence: dozens of unsent, obsessive letters to R and J. They detailed a delusional fantasy of a shared life in an underground sanctuary, chronicling daily routines and Blythe's psychological manipulation. He was trying to create a twisted family dynamic. Bllythe was taken for interrogation. At first, he was calm and composed, denying any knowledge. But the agents laid out the overwhelming evidence: the schematics, the receipts, the letters. His composure began to crack. He became agitated, and his denials became less convincing. Finally, he confessed. The confession was detailed and chillingly emotionless. He admitted to the abduction of Ronan and Jerick Kinsley on July 12, 1997. He had been watching them for weeks. He offered them a ride in his utility truck, claiming to get them out of the storm. Once inside, he incapacitated them with chloroform and took them to the container he had prepared months in advance. He also admitted to a crucial detail that had misled the investigation. He had returned to the cave and tied a specific knot on a root, knowing Ronan was proud of his knot-tying skills. This was a masterful deception designed to make the search focus on an accidental death, diverting suspicion for 11 years. He then revealed the horrific details of their captivity. He described how Ronan, the older brother, never gave in, constantly fighting back and encouraging Jerick to resist. This defiance enraged Bllythe. Several months into the captivity, during a violent confrontation, Bllythe killed Ronan, strangling him after the boy had damaged the ventilation system in an escape attempt. Bllythe described the murder with the same meticulous detail he used to describe the container's construction. Bllythe led investigators to Ronan's burial site in a remote area of the forest. After several hours of digging, they uncovered skeletal remains, later confirmed to be Ronan Kinsley. The discovery was heartbreaking, but provided the Kinsley family with some closure. However, the fate of the younger brother, Jerick, remained a mystery. When pressed, Blythe's detailed confession became evasive. He claimed that after Ronan's death, Jerick's spirit was broken. He insisted that around 2001, Jerick managed to escape through the reinforced hatch, a feat investigators considered highly improbable. Authorities believed Bllythe had likely murdered Jerick as well, perhaps when he became too old to control. They suspected Bllythe refused to disclose the location of Jerick's body as a final act of control. They also speculated that Bllythe hadn't fully abandoned the container, but instead kept it for future victims. The discovery by the loggers likely thwarted his plans. Orson Bllythe was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Ronan Kinsley and the kidnapping of Jerick Kinsley. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, he pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without parole. While the recovery of Ronan's remains provided closure, Jerick's body was never found. His ultimate fate remains officially unresolved. The silence of the Oakhaven forest still holds the final secret of the vanished Boy Scouts.